Welcome to Mindset Tools Mastery. I'm David Phelan, and in this presentation, we're going to focus on mindset tool visualized rehearsal. And we're going to focus on that with the intent of helping you to get results faster and with a higher degree of certainty. So first of all, a little context. When I work with my clients, whether it's here in my office or whether we're doing it via Zoom or phone, I'm oftentimes helping them to think about what's going on with their life, and they're coming to see me because there is a problem that they are addressing, there's a result that they want to get. So my work with them is to help them to look at how their mind is working and in the context of what's going on with their body, and to see if they can make adjustments that help them to be able to solve the problems they're dealing with and to get the results that they're interested in. And so visualized rehearsal is one of these tools that we use. And so as you think about this work, what I'd like you to be thinking about is, are there any particular problems that you are facing right now? It could be something that is going on in your family. It could be something that is going on with your business. It could be other relationships, it could be your finances, it could be your emotional well-being, it could be your sense of spiritual connection. Is there any area of your life where things are not going the way that you would like them to go? And as you think about that, and as we go through this presentation, I want you to be thinking about, is there any way that this particular tool might be helpful to you? And so as we talk about visualize rehearsal, it has a long history, and this is the kind of situation where psychologists are more recently catching up with things that other people have known for a really long time. And it wasn't that psychologists didn't know it, it's just that it wasn't studied, it wasn't researched as thoroughly as it could have been, while at the same time people like athletes and performers, it's something that they are frequently using. So what I mean when I say visualize rehearsal, what I mean is our ability to think about the result that we want and to be able to create that in our mind. So the way that an athlete might use that is, so think about a batter who's standing in the on-deck circle and is thinking about the pitcher that he's going to be hitting against and imagining getting a hit off that pitcher. So that is an example. He's thinking about the result that he wants, he's thinking about his performance, and he's imagining it. So that would be one example of the kind of thing that I'm talking about when I use the term visualize rehearsal. Now, before we get into more about how to do it and when to apply it and those kinds of things, I want to give you a little background for when this works, why does it actually work? And if you've seen any of my other presentations, then you may be familiar with this exercise. Often when I'm working with clients, I ask them to imagine eating something that they would really enjoy eating. And so just think about that. What's something that you would really enjoy eating? Okay? Now imagine that you're eating that and it's been prepared exceptionally well. It's just really, really good. And imagine that you take a bite into it. And then think about the texture as you chew and the flavor swirling around in your mouth. Think about how pleasant it would be to swallow. Imagine taking another bite that's even better than the first. And as you do that, notice what starts to happen in your mouth. For most clients that I work with, when they think about eating something that they really enjoy, their mouth starts to water. And then we talk about the fact that their body is creating a very real reaction, the production of saliva, to something that's not real. There was no food there. And what that means is that the body doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's vividly imagined. And so, again, you might have heard me talk about the research that's related to that. In one experiment, they had a person sit still and not thinking about anything in particular, and they did an EEG of his brain. They were looking at what parts of the brain light up, right? In the second part of the experiment, they had that same person play notes on a piano. And again, they did another EEG, and they looked at the two EEGs, and they're very different. The one from sitting still, not thinking about anything in particular, to playing the notes on the piano, the two EEGs are very different. In the third part of the experiment, the researchers asked him, again, to sit still, but this time they asked him to think about playing notes on the piano. And they did another scan of the brain. Well, the brain scan of him sitting still, thinking about playing notes on the piano, and the brain scan of him actually playing are identical. The brain doesn't differentiate between what it is doing and what it is thinking about, right? The body doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's vividly imagined. So in visualized rehearsal, we are going to use that to our advantage. The idea that the body doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's vividly imagined is so pronounced in certain situations that you can have pretty stark changes, right? So I was once working with a soldier that had just gotten back from Afghanistan, and he was suffering a lot of PTSD symptoms. And this, at the time, is Phoenix had photo radar on our freeways. And he said, you know that flash that you see when the photo radar goes off? He said, that's the same flash that you see when an IED explodes, right? He would get that flash, and then his mind would go right back to the battlefield, and his body didn't know that it was there, so it would start, his heart would start pounding, he would start pouring sweat, he would, you know, his body tension was off the charts, right? So that's how dramatic the effect can be. He wasn't in a battle zone, he was just sitting in a car, but because his body doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's vividly imagined, when his mind created that vivid recollection of the battlefield scene, his body went into full state. And so when we're talking about visualized rehearsal, we're not talking about a small reaction, right? The reaction that we can get with this is huge. So recognize that this principle that the body doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's vividly imagined is happening all the time anyways. And if we recognize that it's happening, then we can use it to our advantage. And that's one of the things that I love about the work that I do, is looking at how the mind actually works, right? And then being able to understand that and then use that to our advantage to be able to solve the problems that we're dealing with, to be able to get the results that we truly desire. Okay, so again, it's happening all the time, and we can get really profound results from this. So an example of visualized rehearsal, we talked about the baseball batter, but I want you to think about somebody like an Olympic gymnast, right? If you've ever watched the Olympics, oftentimes right before the athletes run or their performance, the camera zooms in on their face. And you oftentimes will see the gymnast with their eyes closed and their head kind of moving around. Now, what are they doing with that? Right? They're visualizing their performance. And why are they doing that? Because they know that if they visualize the performance, they're going to increase the likelihood that they're able to perform at that level. Now, what's the actual research behind that? So they've done experiments, and one example that I remember reading about was they had taken downhill slalom skiers who were competing at about the same level to a new downhill course, one that they had never skied before. And they broke them into two groups, and one group went down, and I forget the exact number, but it was like 6 or 8 times they actually went down the course. And the other group went down half as many times, but then they visualized going down the other half. And so then at the end, their performance was compared, and the group that had visualized was skiing just as well as the group that had actually gone down more times. So that's the kind of power that we're talking about. We can actually improve our performance just by visualization. So let's talk about how to apply it. So I'd like you to think about what I asked you at the beginning of our presentation today. what's a problem that you are working on there? What's the result that you would like to accomplish? And I'd like you to think about that, and I'd like you to imagine it in as much detail as you can. Now, when I'm working with clients, sometimes they tell me they have a hard time visualizing, they have a hard time imagining things. And often the misconception with that is that they think about it as if they are, like it should be a Polaroid picture in their mind. And often that is not the case with people, right? They have a representation of it, but it's not crystal clear like a Polaroid. So if you experience challenges visualizing, one, know that that's a very common challenge, and two, also know that you can get better at it with practice. Just last week, I was working with one of my clients on this, and she was having difficulty visualizing, and she had brought a drink with her, right? And so I asked her to look at the drink and then to close her eyes and imagine the drink. And I asked her if she was able to do that. And she said, yeah, but it's kind of fuzzy. And I said, okay, open your eyes and look at it again. Close your eyes and imagine it. And we did that several times. And she said that by the last time that we did that, she had a much clearer image in her mind. Okay? So if you just know that you can get better at it, but some of my clients really, really, really struggle with that, and that's okay too. Sometimes what we do is, rather than getting stuck in not being able to visualize, is I just ask them to write it down. Like, tell yourself what it would be like. So think about the result that you want, and think about it in as much detail as you can. As I'm having clients think about results, oftentimes they'll get like the main elements. I was working with a client this morning, and she was talking about having a great relationship. That's the result that she wanted, right? And so she could bring to mind her being with another person, and she could bring to mind some details, like it would be great to be, walking on the beach and holding hands, right? But then we asked her to go into much more detail about it. So I asked her to think about, like, she told me that she wanted to own a home with this person. Okay, so imagine sitting on the couch, right? Imagine that she told me that they wanted to have 2 dogs. So imagine that you're sitting on the couch and that one of the dogs has his head in your lap and you're scratching the dog, and think about the TV, think about the pictures. And she was able to come up with the detail of having a picture on the wall of their wedding day. And so, okay, more and more details. The more details you can add, the more powerful it becomes, okay? And so then when you're adding details, think about the 5 senses, what you see, what you hear, you feel, you smell, you taste. The more vivid you can make it, remember that the body doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's vividly imagined. If your imagination, if your idea about it is sort of vague, it doesn't impact the body in the same way. And so as I'm helping clients to think about the results that they want, let's say it's they're creating a new program, right? And they're trying to do the marketing for that, and they're trying to increase the number of sales that they have. So think about that. That's the result that they want, and I'm asking them to create that in as much detail as possible. Why? Because we want that to become compelling to them. Okay? So again, remember that visualizing vividly is the key. Okay, now, if you know how to do the visualization of it, and then the rehearsing part of it is you see yourself doing the things that are necessary to get the result that you want. So my client that wanted to have a great relationship, she could imagine herself having a conversation with her partner and imagine that conversation going really well. She could imagine herself, her partner saying or doing something that she doesn't like, and then imagining having the kind of reaction that she wants to have. So we're thinking about the result, visualizing the result, but then also visualizing the things that we need to do to be able to get that result. Okay? So when are the times that we want to engage in visualized rehearsal? Okay? There's several that I would suggest. One would be anytime you're engaged in a planning session. So the more clear you are about the result, the more likely you are to accomplish it. So you might be just sitting down for the first time thinking about a project that you want to work on, right? So you want to visualize both the end results as well as visualize yourself doing the things that are necessary to be able to get that result. When I'm talking with clients, I one of the things that I try to help them to see is don't get stuck in the how of it. If you don't know exactly how you're going to do it right now, that's okay. But you can still imagine the result, and you can still imagine the things that you do know, right? I may not have, the 10-point plan to get there yet, but I might know, one or two of the steps. Great. Just imagine myself doing one or two of those steps. And as you continue working during your planning session, know that the more details you add, the more vivid it's going to become, the more powerful it becomes for you. Okay, so planning sessions is one time that you can use the visualized rehearsal. Another opportunity to use visualized rehearsal is in your prep time. Like, think about an example would be when I was getting ready to do this live presentation today. I thought about what it was going to be like for me. Now, there were a number of challenges that occurred right before the presentation. And if I had more time, I could imagine myself going through each one of those challenges and being able to help them go well. I think about at the beginning of my day when I'm getting ready to see my clients. Imagine myself going through my sessions with my clients and doing well with them. Now, I don't want you to get the wrong impression. I'm not saying that I do this every time, but I do know that the more often I use it, the more powerful it becomes, and the better results that I'm likely to get. So during your planning sessions is a good time to use visualized rehearsal. During your prep time for whatever the activity is going to be. Another useful time to use it is in what I call visualized exposure. So many of my counseling clients are dealing with some kind of anxiety. And if you look at the research related to overcoming anxiety, the strategy that has been demonstrated to be the most effective is exposure. And what that means is go and do the thing that makes you anxious, go and do it over and over and over again, and eventually it won't make you anxious, right? But the challenge with that is sometimes I'm working with clients and their level of anxiety is just really through the roof. And so I try to help them to understand that the way their mind works, and one of the ways that we can deal with the level of anxiety is to visualize the exposure before we ever actually go and do it. So I was working with a firefighter, and she was a female firefighter, and as you can probably imagine, it's really difficult to be a woman in a male-dominated profession like firefighting is. And so she had worked really hard to get to where she was. And one day while she was at work, she was assaulted. And so she had really intense reactions to just even thinking about being at the fire station, right? And so as we were talking about exposure and what that would look like, her body just really tensed up. And so I helped her to know that you don't have to worry about doing that right now. We'll get there. And so the first thing that I had her do was just to visualize being a mile away from the station and just like standing on the street corner, right? And then turn towards the fire station and then notice the anxiety come up. And then we worked on helping her to bring the anxiety back down. Now keep in mind, she's not really there. This is all just in her imagination. But because the body doesn't know the difference between what's real and what's vividly imagined, it still works. And so once she was able to imagine herself being calm there, then I asked her to imagine moving a block closer. And again, the anxiety went up. And then she worked on managing the anxiety. And eventually she was able to imagine being able to tolerate it there. And then we went block by block until she was able to imagine being in the station, being in the location where she was assaulted, and being able to visualize being there without anxiety. We did all of that work before she ever went and tried it in real life. Okay, so visualized exposure. If there's something that you are struggling with, you can imagine yourself doing it, and that works really well to kind of test what it's going to be like for you. I often tell my clients, if you can imagine yourself doing it, there's a really good chance that you'll actually be able to do it when I'm talking about dealing with anxiety, because the body doesn't know the difference. If they imagine it and their anxiety shoots up, we know that we've got some work to do. So our planning sessions is a good time to use visualize rehearsal. Prep time is a good time to use visualize rehearsal. Using it for a visualize exposure is good. Another good time to use it is if you find yourself in a situation where you're stuck. Maybe that you're working on a program. So some of you know that I launched an anxiety management program, and the launch of it didn't go as well as I would like. The marketing didn't go as well as I would like. And so trying to figure out, okay, how am I going to deal with that? What am I going to do next? There was a time that I was feeling stuck, okay? That's an example of the kind of thing that I'm talking about. And one place where we can get stuck is trying to figure out how, like what to do next. So if we find ourselves stuck in that, if we can move to visualization, if we can see ourselves with the result that we want, and see ourselves doing any of the steps that we know will be necessary to get there, or even if we're not sure exactly the steps, if we can visualize what we'll be doing when we get the result, sometimes that's enough just to help us to get unstuck. Okay? So if we get stuck, it can be another good time to use visualize rehearsal. And then just a couple more that I'd like to share with you. One is for what I call recovery strategies. Sometimes we go through something difficult or unpleasant, and that really gets stuck in our mind. Maybe we didn't show up the way that we wanted to. Maybe we had an embarrassing moment. Maybe we overreacted to something, okay? So after that episode has happened, oftentimes we feel sort of disheartened because things didn't go the way that we want them to go. But one of the things I try to help my clients to recognize is that after the episode is actually a position of strength, because no matter how difficult or unpleasant it actually was, people were able to use the resources that they have after the episode that they weren't able to use during the episode, right? So as difficult as it was, the more difficult it was, the more heroic it was that you got through it. And now that you are through it, you've got all the resources available to you. And also there's no statute of limitations on being able to address something that didn't go well before. So visualize rehearsal, what you can do in that situation is put yourself back in that situation in your mind and imagine responding differently in that situation. How do you want to have acted? And oftentimes what I do with my clients is I ask them to imagine it 10 times for every one time that it didn't go well, right? So sometimes I talk about a situation of overreacting with my daughter, right? If I go into a room to talk with her and she gives me attitude and I yell and I storm out of the room, well, that's not the way that I want to be, right? So I can use visualize rehearsal to imagine myself being able to handle that differently and do that 10 times for the one time that it happened, because the reason that I want to do that is I'm trying to create a situation in my body, in my physiology, that's as if the negative thing didn't happen in the first place. Now, I know that it did. It's still on me to apologize and make amends, but we're talking about what's the physiological representation of that. And visualize rehearsal can change that. Another good time to use visualize rehearsal in terms of the timing, like during the day, when is the best time? Think about goals that you have tried to pursue. Have you ever been in the situation where you said, I'm going to do this thing, right? And your inner critic says, no, you're not, or you can't do that, or right? So we have an inner critic. The inner critic is the thing that is trying to tell us that we can't or that it won't work. And if we recognize what our inner critic is doing is really trying to keep us safe, and because it thinks that doing something that's unknown, doing something that's different, is more hazardous than the status quo. So if we recognize that, then we can be gentle with ourselves when that happens, and we can use the way the mind works to our advantage. Part of that is the inner critic is the first part of our mind to go to sleep at night. So in that stage when you're in bed and you're getting sleepy and you're about to drift off, right? Your inner critic at that point is already asleep. So if you take the time right before you go to sleep to visualize the results that you want, you're less likely to have interference from the inner critic. So I recommend people to visualize the next day, to imagine things the next day going really well. That's one way to use the imagine rehearsal. So the inner critic is the first part of the mind to go to sleep at night. It's also the last part to wake up in the morning. So right when you wake up is another good time to use visualize rehearsal, because you're going to get less interference from the internal critic. Okay, and so and then the last time is actually during your practice. There may be certain things that you do with the intent of getting better at it. If you are practicing a language, if you want to get better at speaking a language, if you are trying to figure out social media, if you are trying to train your dog to act differently, right? And you have this sense of, I'm going to have to do this over and over and over to get the hang of it, right? So you can use visualize rehearsal during those practice times. You can do some of the practices in real life, but then you can also imagine some of the rehearsal, and that works well too. So as you can see, there are a lot of applications for using this tool. If you're not currently working with me, but you would like to, please feel free to reach out and we'll see if we can get something set up. Thank you again for joining us today, and have a blessed day.